At 6:15 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Second Lieutenant Charles Counts climbed into the cockpit of his Brewster F2A Buffalo at Midway Atoll, fully aware that he was about to pilot an aircraft that likely would not survive its mission. The Buffalo was outdated and widely recognized as such. Marines who flew it nicknamed it the Flying Coffin. This plane was overweight, underpowered, and hopelessly outclassed by the Japanese fighters it would soon encounter. Kun was 22 years old and had been stationed at Midway for 3 weeks. This mission marked his first combat sortie. Radar operators had detected a large incoming Japanese air raid headed toward the island from about 93 miles away, advancing rapidly. 36 Zeros provided escort to the bombers. The Zero fighter excelled in every aspect. It was faster, more agile, and could outmaneuver the Buffalo at all altitudes. American tactical doctrine emphasized avoiding direct dogfights with Zeros due to their superiority. Instead, pilots were instructed to use hit and run tactics and avoid turning engagements whenever possible. However, the Buffalo offered no such advantages. It lagged behind the Zero in speed and maneuverability, possessing only slightly better armor protection, but at the cost of reduced performance and responsiveness. Midway's Marine contingent had 21 Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F4F Wildcats available for deployment. The Wildcats were slightly superior, but only marginally so. The majority of pilots were assigned to the Buffaloes. Kun was among them. On that morning, 26 fighters took flight. Only 14 would return by evening. The Buffalo's performance was far worse than expected. When it first flew in December 1937, it marked a significant leap for United States Navy. It featured retractable landing gear and was their first monoplane fighter, replacing outdated biplanes. In 1938, during its prototype phase, it exceeded 300 mm and exhibited acceptable handling qualities. The Navy then placed an order for 54 aircraft. Production commenced in 1939. However, issues began to arise shortly after. As development progressed, the production version, designated FF2A1, gained considerable weight due to additional features requested by the Navy, such as increased fuel capacity, ammunition storage, heavier armament, armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Each addition made sense individually, but collectively they compromised the aircraft's performance severely. The F2A2 model further added more weight with extra equipment. By 1941, when the F2A3 entered service, it had gained over 300 pounds compared to the original prototype. Its engine remained unchanged at a WRA-R18 20 Cyclone, producing 950 horsepower, which was barely sufficient for the lighter initial design. With the added weight, the Buffalo became dangerously underpowered, reducing its maximum speed to 310 of MFF and its rate of climb to 2,000 feet per minute. The aircraft felt sluggish and lacked responsiveness. Pilots complained about the heavy controls and described the plane as struggling to maneuver like it was moving through thick water. The wing loading increased significantly due to a heavier airframe, which the smaller wings could not support efficiently. This resulted in high stall speeds and poor low-speed handling, precisely the opposite of what you would want in a fighter designed for dogfights. Furthermore, the landing gear proved insufficiently robust. Hard landings often damaged it severely, causing bent struts and collapsed wheels. Maintenance crews spent countless hours fixing issues that should have been addressed earlier. The most troubling aspect was that these problems were evident months before Midway Island. The F2A Buffalo saw its first combat deployment in early 1942 during the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia. Royal Air Force squadrons based in Malaya and Singapore flew Buffaloes against Japanese fighters, including A6M Zeros and K-43 Oscars. The results were disastrous. British pilots noted that the Buffalo was outmatched in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability compared to its Japanese counterparts. Whether they attempted to dogfight or tried to escape by diving, they faced certain death. Similar challenges plagued Dutch pilots flying B339 export models of the Buffalo, which was slightly lighter than the American F2A3 variant but still struggled against enemy aircraft. Despite its lighter weight, the aircraft proved inferior against Japanese fighters. Within 3 months of combat, most Dutch Buffaloes had been destroyed. Several Dutch pilots even referred to the Buffalo as a deadly hazard. Despite these alarming reports from the Pacific Theater, the United States Marine Corps continued using Buffaloes at Midway because no better options were available. Superior fighter planes existed but were deployed elsewhere, either aboard aircraft carriers or with squadrons in Hawaii. Consequently, Midway received the less desirable aircraft. In late 1941, Marine Fighting Squadron 221 under Major Floyd Park's command was equipped with a mix of 21 Buffaloes and 7 Wildcats. For months, the squadron trained extensively with these planes. The pilots became well acquainted with the Buffalo's limitations, its poor climb rate, sluggish roll response, and tendency to drift during turns. Although they devised tactics to mitigate these issues, it was clear that having a capable aircraft to execute such maneuvers was essential. Major Parks recognized that his squadron was equipped with outdated fighters. At 34 years old, Parks had been flying since 1931 and closely monitored reports from Asia. He understood the dire fate that befell Buffalo pilots who faced Zeros. On June 4th, he addressed his pilots before they scrambled into action. Major Parks stressed the importance of maintaining a higher altitude, adhering to formation discipline, and avoiding prolonged engagements. His advice was sound. The inherent limitations of the Buffalo aircraft proved insurmountable. Upon radar detection of the Japanese assault at 5:55 a.m., Parks issued a prompt launch order. His squadron swiftly mobilized, and within minutes, 26 fighters ascended to an altitude of 1,000 feet in an attempt to intercept the approaching enemy before they arrived. Parks strategically divided his aircraft into 5 units, with 4 divisions operating Buffaloes and 1 division flying Wildcats. Around 6:40 a.m., he observed the Japanese formation approximately 30 miles northwest of Midway, consisting of more than 100 planes. Bombers escorted by a contingent of 36 Zeros, all flying in tight formations at 14,000 feet. With his fighters positioned at 15,000 feet between the Japanese and Midway, Parks commanded the attack. The 1st Division, under Parks' direct leadership, initiated an assault on the bombers. This small force of 5 Buffaloes faced off against a formidable fleet of over 100 enemy aircraft. They managed only 1 pass before encountering fierce resistance from the Zeros. Parks engaged a bomber, his tracer rounds hitting its fuselage, but was quickly pursued by 3 diving Zeros. Attempting to evade them, he tried a steep dive followed by a hard turn, but the sluggish response of the Buffalo left him vulnerable as the nimble Zeros continued their relentless pursuit, maintaining constant fire. Parks' Buffalo sustained multiple impacts. 20 mm cannon shells pierced the right wing and fuselage. Smoke started coming from the engine. Parks attempted to dive toward Midway, aiming for a crash landing on the island, but never succeeded. His aircraft disintegrated at around 5,000 feet due to structural failure caused by combat damage and high-speed maneuvers. Parks perished instantly. Within 7 minutes, his entire division was obliterated. 2nd Lieutenant Charles Kunn was part of the 3rd Division Flying Buffalo fighters. 4 Buffaloes were assigned to engage the fighter escorts. Kunn observed as Parks' division was decimated, with burning aircraft falling into the ocean. The Zeros then turned toward his formation. Kunn had roughly 15 seconds to make a decision. American military doctrine advised maintaining speed, using altitude, and avoiding turning engagements, but the Zeros were already at his altitude, and his Buffalo could not outmaneuver them in level flight. He had no viable options. He initiated a defensive turn, attempting to force the pursuing Zero fighters to overshoot. The controls of the Buffalo felt stiff and unresponsive. As he pulled back on the stick, the nose lifted slowly. At an agonizing pace, a Zero appeared behind him and began firing relentlessly. Kunn witnessed tracer bullets whizzing past his cockpit canopy. His plane was riddled with impacts, and he could hear the sharp sounds of cannon shells striking the metal exterior. Despite attempting to roll and dive away, the Buffalo was too sluggish to respond effectively. The fuselage sustained additional hits, causing the instrument panel to explode and the engine to seize up. Violent vibrations followed as the plane faltered. Realizing his predicament, Kun fought to maintain control, gaining some speed before ditching into the sea approximately 3 miles from Midway Island. Miraculously, he survived, though his aircraft sank within 2 minutes. Out of the 26 Marine fighters that took off that morning, 17 were shot down. 14 of these losses were attributed to the Buffalo models. This left Marine Fighting Squadron 221 essentially non-existent as an operational unit. The Japanese suffered only 5 fighter casualties in comparison. The casualty ratio was devastating. For every single zero down by a Marine pilot, more than 3 American aircraft met their end. The majority of these losses were incurred by the Buffalo planes. Surviving pilots recounted similar harrowing experiences. The plane was too sluggish to evade its adversaries, too uncooperative for aerial combat maneuvers, and inadequately armed to secure swift victories. A handful of pilots succeeded in damaging Japanese aircraft, but were unable to finish them off due to the Buffalo's inability to maintain pursuit. The few Marines who managed to score kills did so at close range and often sustained damage in the process. Captain Marion Carl, flying a Wildcat, downed 2 enemy planes but described the encounter as frantic and disorganized. He noted that the Wildcats were barely satisfactory, while the Buffaloes were considerably inferior. Following the battle, surviving Marine pilots at Midway refused to fly Buffaloes again in combat situations. Within weeks, the squadron was re-equipped with Wildcat aircraft, and every remaining Buffalo at Midway was either grounded for parts stripped down or used as a target for gunnery practice. The operational career of the Buffalo within the United States military effectively concluded after the Battle of Midway. It had been in service for less than 6 months. However, the Buffalo was not alone among inadequately designed fighter aircraft during World War II. Other nations also fielded planes that were similarly disastrous and often resulted in higher casualties among their own pilots than enemy losses. Germany, known for producing some of the war's most effective fighters, also created one of its worst designs, the Messerschmitt Me210. Intended to replace the Bf 110 heavy fighter, this aircraft instead nearly ruined Messerschmitt's reputation and compelled the Luftwaffe to continue using outdated planes for years. Development on the Me210 began in 1937 before the 110 had even entered full production. The engineers at Messerschmitt aimed to create a versatile aircraft capable of serving as a heavy fighter, reconnaissance plane, and fast bomber. On paper, the design appeared promising. It featured 2 Daimler-Benz DB6-in-1 engines, each producing 1150 horsepower, a more streamlined fuselage than its predecessor, better crew visibility, and remotely controlled defensive armament turrets. Impressed by these specifications, the Reich Air Ministry ordered 1,000 aircraft in mid-1940 before any prototypes had even flown. This decision turned out to be a grave error. The initial M2000 V1 prototype took to the skies on September 2, 1939. Almost immediately, the test pilot encountered significant handling issues. The aircraft exhibited pronounced longitudinal and directional instability, causing it to oscillate uncontrollably during flight. Even without any input from the controls, the plane would snake left and right. During turns, this instability escalated into a dangerous situation, with unexpected pitch changes making precise maneuvers impossible. Engineers attempted various modifications, including switching from a twin-tail configuration to a single large vertical stabilizer. Unfortunately, these efforts yielded minimal improvement. The aircraft continued to oscillate persistently. An additional attempt to address the problem involved installing automatic leading edge slats to improve stall behavior, but this only exacerbated the situation. When the nose was raised or during turns, the slats would deploy, triggering violent spins that were nearly impossible to recover from. The second prototype, M210 VT2, met with disaster in September 1940 when it crashed during flutter tests. The pilot barely escaped before the aircraft disintegrated. He reported that once a spin began, recovery was improbable. The chief test pilot for MESID summarized the plane's characteristics as embodying all of the most undesirable traits an airplane could have. Nevertheless, production proceeded despite these critical flaws. The Reich Air Ministry was desperate to replace the Bf-1110, which had demonstrated significant vulnerabilities against British fighters during the Battle of Britain. They pushed Messit to expedite the repair of the Me210 and rush it into service. A total of 16 prototypes and 94 pre-production models were manufactured as part of efforts to address design shortcomings, but these attempts proved futile. The core issue lay with the aircraft's aerodynamics. The wing configuration resulted in insufficient directional stability, while the fuselage was disproportionately short compared to the tail surfaces. Additionally, the center of gravity was improperly positioned, all of which indicated major flaws rather than minor adjustments that could be easily rectified. A thorough redesign was necessary, a fact Messerschmitt recognized, but the Reich Air Ministry refused to acknowledge. Production commenced early in 1941, with deliveries to front-line units beginning in April 1942. The pilots immediately disliked the aircraft. Vera Streib, a seasoned night fighter pilot with extensive combat experience, evaluated the Me210 and concluded that it was unsuitable for operational use due to its inherent instability, which made it challenging to maintain as a steady gun platform during dogfights. This unpredictability put the pilot at greater risk than the enemy. Furthermore, landing posed significant dangers. The Me210's landing gear was weak and often collapsed upon touchdown, exacerbating the aircraft's already problematic flight characteristics. As a result, numerous accidents occurred during routine landings, leading to several fatalities and severe injuries among pilots who were not engaged in combat operations at the time. By April 1942, following the delivery of around 90 Me210s, the Luftwaffe made a surprising decision. They halted production entirely. They instructed that all further deliveries be stopped at once. Instead, they resumed production of the Bf-110, an aircraft they had previously planned to phase out due to its superior performance compared to the Me210, despite being several years older. 2 partially completed Me210s were stored away, but the Luftwaffe refused to accept them. Messerschmitt attempted to salvage the situation by developing a more advanced version called the Me410, which featured an extended fuselage and more powerful engines. Although the Me410 resolved some of the issues with its predecessor and saw limited operational use, it failed to completely overcome the negative perception created by the Me210's shortcomings. The Me210 project was a total failure in German aircraft development, as the aircraft was ordered on a large scale before thorough testing had been completed. Design flaws were disregarded in favor of maintaining production schedules, resulting in pilots being compelled to fly an airplane more likely to malfunction and cause their death than enemy fire. The entire initiative squandered resources, delayed the creation of better aircraft, and eroded pilot confidence in Messerschmitt designs. Italy also experienced a significant failure with the Bar88 Linz. This aircraft was so poorly designed that it struggled to take off even with a combat load, and when it did manage to get airborne, it could barely maintain altitude or fly in formation with other planes. The Bar88 began development in 1936 as an all-purpose aircraft intended for roles such as heavy fighter, reconnaissance, and ground attack missions. Its design appeared modern, featuring a sleek metal fuselage, retractable landing gear, and twin Popey-1 radial engines generating 1,000 horsepower each. The prototype made its first flight in October 1936 and immediately garnered attention from observers. It achieved incredible speeds exceeding 300 mph. In April 1937, Furio Niccolo, an Italian test pilot, established 2 world speed records over distance with the Bar88 prototype. He averaged 321 mph for a 100 km stretch and 295 mph for a 1,000 km course. The aircraft was hailed by fascist propaganda as evidence of Italy's engineering prowess. Following this success, the Italian Air Ministry greenlit production of the Bar88. However, reality soon shattered these illusions. The production models were considerably heavier than their prototype counterparts by more than 2,000 pounds due to added military equipment such as armor, weapons, ammunition, radios, and operational systems that the original version did not include. Despite maintaining the same engines, performance plummeted dramatically. Production Bar-88s could only manage a top speed of around 200 mph with an abysmal climb rate. They found it challenging to attain even 10,000 feet under full combat load conditions. The increased wing loading made the aircraft highly unstable and difficult to control. A critical issue was that the Bar-88 was over-engineered from the start. Its design featured both a traditional steel tube internal structure and a stressed skin exterior, essentially doubling its structural weight without providing any practical benefit. While this construction ensured exceptional strength beyond combat requirements, it rendered the aircraft too heavy for efficient flight. During evaluation trials in 1939, Italian Air Force test pilots noted these issues and suggested halting production. However, political factors took precedence over operational realities, and their recommendations were disregarded by the government. Cancelling the Bar-88 would have entailed shutting down production lines and acknowledging that Italian technological prowess had been overstated by fascist propaganda. However, production persisted, resulting in a total of 81 aircraft manufactured by Brada and an additional 24 units produced by IMA. When Italy joined World War II in June 1940, several squadrons were outfitted with Bar-88s. The 7th Gruppo Autonoma was tasked with operating these planes for engagements in North Africa. The aircraft's first operational outing occurred on June 16, 1940. During Italian strikes against French airfields in Corsica, 12 Bar-88s took part in this raid. Due to the absence of French resistance, the Italian planes successfully completed their missions without suffering any losses. However, pilots reported that the aircraft was severely underpowered and difficult to handle. These issues would soon become even more pronounced. In August 1940, the 7th Gruppo was relocated to Libya to engage British forces. Desert conditions necessitated modifications to the Bar-88s, including the installation of sand filters on their engines to prevent dust intake. Unfortunately, these filters impeded airflow and reduced engine power by roughly 30%, exacerbating the aircraft's already inadequate performance. On September 14, 1940, the 7th Unit was instructed to assault the British airfield at Siti Alani, located approximately 250 kilometers behind enemy lines. 3 Bar-88s were allocated for this mission, each loaded with 250 kilograms of bombs, full ammunition, and fully fueled tanks. The attack never materialized. The first Bar-88 attempted a takeoff, but failed to achieve sufficient speed and aborted before reaching the end of the runway. Although the second aircraft managed to become airborne, it immediately began losing altitude. The pilot was unable to sustain steady flight and had to return to the airfield, thus aborting the mission. Meanwhile, the third aircraft piloted by the unit commander managed to take off but could not ascend beyond 500 meters. Despite flying towards the target, he continued to lose altitude gradually. Realizing that reaching El Barani was impossible, he dropped his bombs in an empty desert and returned to base at a very low altitude. Consequently, the mission ended in complete failure as none of the 3 planes reached their objective or dropped any bombs on the enemy. One plane did not even manage to take off. The Italian commanders were deeply dismayed by this outcome. Having 22 aircraft that could not accomplish basic tasks was detrimental rather than beneficial. These aircraft wasted fuel, required maintenance, occupied pilots and ground crews, yet offered no combat effectiveness whatsoever. Various desperate measures were attempted to enhance performance, including removing the rear gunner and rear gun for weight reduction, stripping internal equipment, reducing bomb loads to 100 kg, and decreasing fuel levels to half tanks. However, none of these adjustments made a significant impact on improving the aircraft's capabilities. By mid-November 1940, just 5 months after Italy's entry into the war, all remaining Bar-88s in North Africa were grounded due to their fundamental inability to perform their missions effectively. All useful equipment was taken away, including weapons and radios. The empty airframes were then dispersed across Italian airfields as decoys. British reconnaissance planes would capture images of these fake fighter aircraft and misreport them as operational Italian fighters, wasting resources on tracking non-flying machines. This deceptive role was the most practical use for the Baer-88, acting as a stationary target to deceive the enemy. The decline was total. An aircraft that had set world speed records in 1937 was now serving merely as an immobile decoy by 1940. The Regia Aeronautica was compelled to continue using outdated planes like the Brada 65 and Fiat CR-32 biplanes because the modern Baer-88 was inferior even to those from a decade prior. Further deliveries of Baer-88s continued into 1940 and 1941, but most were sent straight from the factory to scrap yards. Usable parts were salvaged while the airframes themselves were destroyed. Approximately 150 Baer-88s were manufactured in total. Few saw active combat after September 1940. It could be argued that this aircraft was one of the most comprehensive failures among World War II combat planes. Though it appeared modern and achieved notable records as a lightweight prototype, its military application rendered it utterly ineffective. 3 other aircraft: the Brewster Buffalo, Messerschmitt Me210, and Brigadier-88 shared similar traits that made them exceptionally inadequate. Each of these planes showed promise during initial stages but suffered from significant weight increases that hindered their performance. Despite warnings from test pilots, they entered service and often posed greater risks to their own pilots than threats to the enemy. The human toll of flying such deficient aircraft was substantial. By mid-morning on Midway, 14 Buffalo pilots had perished due to their planes' inability to compete against Japanese fighters. Among them was Major Floyd Parks, a seasoned squadron leader whose Buffalo could not perform the necessary evasive maneuvers to survive aerial combat. Charles Cunn, a second lieutenant, narrowly escaped death by ditching his plane close enough to Midway for rescue boats to reach him before he drowned. German pilots flying the Me210 encountered similar hazards. The aircraft's instability led to numerous accidents even during routine training flights. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Jabs, an accomplished night fighter pilot who had evaluated the Me210, refused to fly it operationally, stating that he would rather use a less advanced BFM-10 than risk his life in such an unreliable aircraft. In North Africa, Italian pilots flying Bar88s faced equally dire circumstances when their planes failed to take off. They recognized these aircraft as death traps and requested transfers to units with older but more reliable machines. Preferring to fly obsolete biplanes that at least had basic functionality over newer models that were prone to failure, they felt compelled by the stark realities of war. The psychological toll on pilots was severe. Combat pilots accept risk as part of their profession, understanding that engaging enemies carries inherent dangers. However, what they could not tolerate was dying due to substandard aircraft. Buffalo pilots at Midway knew from the outset that their planes were inferior compared to those fielded by their adversaries. Despite being ordered into combat, this knowledge undermined their morale and confidence. Survivors of the battle described feeling helpless throughout the engagement, adhering strictly to their training and tactics while making all the right decisions, but still getting shot down because their aircraft lacked the necessary performance capabilities. Captain Marion Corral, one of a few Marine survivors who scored kills at Midway, later revealed in interviews that Buffalo pilots were not killed due to mistakes or poor tactical choices. Instead, they perished because they were sent into battle with inadequate equipment. The responsibility for these losses rested squarely on those decision-makers who continued deploying inferior aircraft despite clear evidence of their shortcomings. German pilots flying the Me210 experienced similar frustrations. They had been assured of receiving an advanced fighter that would dominate the battlefield, but instead were given an unstable plane that posed as much danger to them as it did to their adversaries. This situation severely damaged Messid's reputation. Pilots who previously trusted Messid designs after flying the superior Bf-109 began to doubt the quality of new aircraft from the company. When the Me410 was introduced, many pilots initially refused to fly it, expecting similar issues as those encountered with the Me210. Restoring confidence required numerous demonstration flights and successful combat missions over several months. Italian pilots faced an even more challenging situation due to the BA-88's failure, which exposed significant flaws in Italian military procurement and industrial capacity. This incident led many pilots to question whether any aircraft designed by Italy could be trusted. As a result, skepticism spread throughout the Regia Aeronautica, contributing to widespread morale issues within the entire Air Force. The institutional failures responsible for these subpar aircraft revealed systemic problems in the development of military aviation during the war. In each case, political and bureaucratic pressures overshadowed technical realities. The United States Navy recognized that the Buffalo was obsolete by early 1942, but continued deploying it because there were no sufficient numbers of better alternatives available, and scrapping the Buffalo would have admitted to procurement process failures. German officials ordered 1,000 Me210s before a prototype had even flown because they desperately needed a Bf-110 replacement and assumed that engineering issues could be resolved during production. This assumption proved disastrously incorrect. Italian fascist leadership insisted on putting the BA-88 into production despite test pilots' warnings of safety concerns, as cancelling the program would have been politically embarrassing. These decisions were made by officials distant from combat zones who had no intention of flying the aircraft they approved. The consequences fell upon young pilots, often in their early 20s, who climbed into cockpits knowing that their planes were inferior and potentially lethal. Lieutenant Charles Cunn was only 22 when he flew a Buffalo at Midway. He had been flying for less than a year when the incident occurred. Major Floyd Parks, at 34 years old, was seasoned and proficient in his skills. Both pilots operated the same underperforming aircraft. Despite his experience, Parks could not overcome the inherent limitations of the aircraft. In this case, it wasn't skill that determined the outcome, but rather luck. One pilot died while the other barely escaped injury, both due to which Zero Fighter chose them as its primary target first. The lessons from these tragic events were learned painfully and gradually. The Buffalo model highlighted that increasing an airframe's weight without a corresponding boost in engine power significantly diminishes performance. The Navy's procurement practices permitted piecemeal additions of equipment without considering the cumulative impact on overall aircraft performance. Armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavier armament, and radio gear were all added individually with their own justifications. However, together, these modifications severely degraded the plane's capabilities. Post-war analysis pinpointed several critical junctures where production should have ceased, yet bureaucratic inertia and an aversion to acknowledging errors kept manufacturing moving forward. The Me210 exemplified that once a design is fundamentally flawed, minor adjustments cannot rectify aerodynamic stability issues. Following the crash of its second prototype in September 1940, engineers recommended major redesigns such as extending the fuselage and completely overhauling the tail assembly. These suggestions were dismissed by Regia Ministry officials due to concerns about production delays. Instead, Messerschmitt was instructed to devise solutions that did not necessitate significant structural changes. Over 16 prototypes and nearly 100 pre-production aircraft were constructed in futile attempts to address inherently unsolvable issues. The Luftwaffe ultimately paid the price for this institutional failure through lost pilots' lives and wasted resources. Similarly, the BA-88 demonstrated that over-engineering an airframe to withstand excessive forces beyond combat needs results in a plane too heavy to operate effectively. Italian engineers created a frame robust enough to endure extreme stress far exceeding what was necessary for combat use. Despite being capable of surviving a dive at terminal velocity without sustaining structural damage, the BR-88 was rendered practically obsolete by its inability to attain sufficient altitude or reach high speeds. This excessive robustness originated from an overly cautious design philosophy and insufficient comprehension of stressed skin construction techniques prevalent in the 1930s. At that time, Italian engineers were transitioning from fabric, covered steel tube frames to all metal-stressed skin designs but lacked full confidence in the new methods. Consequently, they incorporated both traditional internal structures and modern stressed skin coverings, resulting in an aircraft with twice the necessary strength and weight. Test pilots promptly reported these issues, highlighting that the BR-88 was excessively heavy from the outset. Engineers suggested removing the redundant internal framework to save around 1,000 kilograms before full-scale production commenced. However, this recommendation was rejected by Italian Air Ministry officials due to concerns about redesigning the structure, conducting new engineering analyses, and incurring potential delays. Officials opted for immediate production of a heavy aircraft rather than delaying deliveries while making improvements. This decision ensured that the BR-88 would fail operationally. Post-war analysis by aviation experts revealed that inadequate testing, political pressures, and bureaucratic inertia contributed to flawed aircraft entering service. In peacetime, such designs would likely have been scrapped after initial test flights exposed their shortcomings. During wartime, the urgent need for large numbers of aircraft often led to compromises in quality control and thorough testing. The Buffalo Me210 and BR-88 exemplified this trend but were not isolated cases. Numerous other aircraft utilized during World War II also encountered comparable issues, albeit to a lesser extent. From the enemy's viewpoint, these planes demonstrated significant inadequacies. Japanese pilots who faced American Buffalo fighters at Midway reported that the latter posed little threat. Lieutenant Yoshio, a Zero pilot involved in the raid on Midway, stated in post-war interviews that downing Buffalo fighters was easier than engaging Japanese aircraft during training exercises. The Buffalo fighters were slower and less maneuverable, making it impossible for them to escape once a Zero got behind them. She recounted an engagement where he pursued a Buffalo attempting to dive away. He easily followed, close to within 100 meters, fired a short burst, and the Buffalo exploded. The entire encounter lasted less than 20 seconds. Japanese pilots at Midway claimed to have shot down 14 American fighters while losing only 5 Zeros. The difference was stark. The engagement was seen as a successful fighter sweep with minimal resistance by the Japanese. They were more worried about American anti-aircraft fire from Midway Island than about the defending fighters. This situation was particularly humiliating for the Buffalo pilots, who were not just outmatched, but also considered insignificant threats by enemy pilots. In Japanese after-action reports from Midway, the American fighters were mentioned only briefly and described as inferior aircraft poorly suited for combat against Zeros. The reports detailed more extensively the attacks by American bombers than the fighter opposition. To the Japanese, the Buffalo fighters at Midway were barely noteworthy. German pilots shared similar opinions about the Me210. Those who switched from the Bf-110 to the Me210 frequently requested transfers back to their previous aircraft. Major Walter Ayer, a pilot with extensive combat experience on both fronts, evaluated the Me210 in 1942 and submitted a comprehensive report stating that it was unsuitable for any combat role. The plane's instability prevented accurate gunnery, its erratic stall behavior made defensive maneuvers perilous, and its frail landing gear posed significant risks even without combat damage. Major Ayer concluded his report by expressing a preference for flying captured British aircraft rather than the Me210 in combat, which was an unusual statement from a German officer suggesting that enemy planes were superior to this new German design. This sentiment was echoed by other pilots who submitted similar reports. The overwhelmingly negative feedback from pilots could not be disregarded by Luftwaffe leadership. When production of the Me210 was halted in April 1942, pilots celebrated with cheers and parties organized by squadron commanders, an unusually enthusiastic response to the cancellation of a new aircraft program. British pilots who encountered the BR-88 had a different experience compared to those at Midway. They never engaged the Italian aircraft in combat because the BR-88 did not reach the battle zone. RAF intelligence officers initially monitored the movements of these modern-looking Italian planes, assuming they were a significant threat. When reconnaissance photographs revealed the Bar88s scattered around Italian airfields, British planners allocated resources to bomb those airbases. It was only months later that they discovered the aircraft were empty decoys. British intelligence expended considerable resources tracking aircraft that were permanently grounded after captured Italian documents exposed the true capabilities of the Bar88 following Italy's surrender in 1943. Analysts were shocked to discover an aircraft that appeared advanced and had set world speed records was incapable of fulfilling basic combat duties. The Bar88 became a cornerstone example in British intelligence training, illustrating why visual assessment alone could be deceptive regarding enemy equipment. An aircraft might appear formidable but prove entirely ineffective in actual warfare. Pilots who flew these subpar machines and survived carried their harrowing experiences for years to come. Charles Counds, a Buffalo pilot who crash-landed during the Battle of Midway, returned to the United States in 1943 after recovering from injuries sustained in his ditching incident. He spent the remainder of World War II flying training missions and never ventured back into combat. In 1946, he left the Marine Corps and worked as a commercial airline pilot for 3 decades. In interviews many years later, Counds described flying the Buffalo at Midway as the most terrifying experience of his life, not due to enemy threats but because he knew his aircraft could not defend him adequately. He remarked that modern fighter pilots operating planes, such as the FF-14 Tomcat or F-15 Eagle, would find it difficult to comprehend what it felt like to fly an inferior aircraft in every measurable aspect. The sense of vulnerability stayed with him each time he piloted a commercial airliner, which was safe and comfortable compared to those perilous moments during Midway. Counds vividly recalled the morning when his Buffalo broke apart under Japanese gunfire and he ditched into the ocean, certain death awaited him. Rescue boats arrived within 30 minutes, saving his life. Sadly, many other Buffalo pilots at Midway did not survive their aircraft's inadequacies in combat situations. Marion Carl, who flew a Wildcat during the battle and lived through it, later became a test pilot after the war. He piloted experimental aircraft, including early jets and rocket planes, achieving the rank of Major General before retiring from the Marine Corps in 1973. Carl noted that even the most dangerous experimental aircraft he tested felt safer than his combat missions at Midway because while experimental planes carried unknown risks, the Buffalo had known limitations that could not be remedied. Carl championed reforms in pilot equipment and aircraft procurement practices. He appeared before Congress repeatedly to underscore the significance of deploying competitive gear. His testimonies often highlighted the roles of Midway and the Buffalo, asserting that subpar equipment led to the deaths of American pilots irrespective of their skills or bravery. Carl's efforts were instrumental in shaping changes in naval aviation procurement policies during the 1950s and 1960s. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 82. German pilots who flew the Me210 refrained from discussing the aircraft in post-war interviews, finding it an uncomfortable topic that recalled institutional shortcomings. Oberleutnant Vera Streib, who assessed the Me210 and deemed it unfit for combat, later became one of Germany's most accomplished night fighter pilots. He flew Bff 110s and subsequently JDAs, amassing 66 confirmed kills by war's end. When asked about the Me210 in post-war interviews, Streib tersely dismissed it as a failed aircraft that should never have been produced and expressed reluctance to elaborate further. Under pressure, he noted that the Me210 harmed German pilot morale more than any Allied fighter because it symbolized their own side's incompetence rather than enemy superiority. Streib passed away in 2001. His personal archives, donated to a German aviation museum, included a detailed diary from 1942. The entries discussed his experiences flying the Me210. Streib expressed doubts about Luftwaffe leadership's concern for pilot safety, wondering what other inadequate equipment pilots might be forced to use if an aircraft as dangerous as the Me210 could be approved for production. This loss of confidence in leadership, he wrote, was more detrimental than the aircraft itself. Italian pilots who flew the Bar-88 viewed it as a national disgrace. Captain Carlo Ruspoli, commanding a squadron equipped with Bar-88s in North Africa, documented his experiences in his memoirs. He described the aircraft as emblematic of every flaw within Italian military procurement practices. It appeared modern and was praised in propaganda, but it failed to accomplish its intended mission. Ruspoli recounted the frustration of being ordered to attack British positions despite flying aircraft that struggled to even take off. He noted that Italian pilots felt let down by their leadership given the subpar equipment they were provided with, which virtually ensured defeat. After grounding the Bar-88s, Ruspoli's squadron was re-equipped with German Bf-109 fighter planes. The difference was stark. While the Messerschmitt models were older designs, they functioned properly and could take off fully loaded, maintain formation in flight, reach combat zones, and engage enemy forces effectively. These basic capabilities seemed like luxuries compared to the Bar-88's shortcomings. Ruspoli survived the war and later became a journalist. Over several decades, he extensively wrote about Italian military history, often critiquing the corruption and incompetence that led to disasters such as the development of the Bar-88. He passed away in 1987. The aircraft, meant to showcase Italy's engineering prowess, instead demonstrated its inability to produce competitive combat planes. This failure contributed to a decline in overall Italian military effectiveness throughout the war, further cementing the perception of Italy as the weakest Axis power. The historical impact of these underperforming aircraft is multifaceted. They are often overlooked in popular histories, focusing on successful designs like the Spitfire, Mustang, Zero, and Messerschmitt Bf-109. Failures receive less attention, documentation, and remembrance. Yet comprehending these failures is crucial for understanding how air combat evolved during World War II. For instance, the Buffalo's poor performance at Midway compelled the United States Navy to hasten the deployment of superior fighters such as the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. If the Buffalo had merely been adequate, there might have been less urgency to develop better replacements. Similarly, the Me210 disaster prompted Messerschmitt to completely overhaul their heavy fighter design approach, eventually leading to the more capable Me410. Although it was not without flaws. The failure of the Bar-88 played a significant role in Italy's choice to purchase German aircraft for its air force, implicitly acknowledging that Italian manufacturing was unable to produce competitive designs. These historical examples serve as cautionary tales for current military procurement practices. The ATI's BT-9S and other problematic models like the Buffalo, Me210, and Bar-88 continue to influence modern military program failures, which often exhibit similar patterns of cost overruns, performance shortfalls, and operational issues. The F-35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter, developed for the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, faced numerous challenges during its development phase, such as weight problems, software delays, and performance compromises due to attempting to meet multiple service requirements with a single aircraft design. Despite these issues, the program was not cancelled because significant political and financial investments had been made. This situation mirrors the Buffalo's predicament, where known flaws were accepted due to lack of immediate alternatives. The lesson is evident yet challenging to apply in practice. The urgency to deploy new equipment quickly, coupled with political and bureaucratic pressures, can overshadow sound engineering judgment. When this occurs, it is not the decision makers but the soldiers, sailors, and pilots who suffer from using inadequate equipment during combat operations. At Midway, Major Floyd Parks and 13 other Marine pilots paid the ultimate price for such decisions. Parks was just 34 years old when he died, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. His death was not heroic in the conventional sense. He was not overwhelmed by enemy forces or caught off guard. Instead, his Buffalo aircraft could not perform adequately under stress, breaking apart mid-flight. When attempting to execute defensive maneuvers, Parks's plane failed him. He fell into the Pacific Ocean and drowned. His body was never found. A telegram notified his widow that he was missing in action. 3 months later, he was officially declared killed in action, with no remains ever returned to his family. His name is inscribed among the thousands of other service members on the tablets of the missing at the Honolulu Memorial in Hawaii. The memorial does not indicate that he died while flying a substandard aircraft. Official records state that he was killed during combat against Japanese forces, which is technically accurate but incomplete. In reality, his government had sent him into battle with inferior equipment. Among those 14 pilots who perished at Midway were seasoned squadron leaders and newly graduated flight school cadets. Some died instantly as their planes exploded, while others managed to parachute out only to drown before rescue arrived. Many bodies remained unrecovered, leaving families with telegrams stating that their loved ones were missing in action. Months later, the status changed to killed in action without any closure or remains returned. Second Lieutenant William Brooke survived being shot down in his Buffalo fighter aircraft despite sustaining significant damage from zero fire during combat. His landing gear failed to retract and he struggled as his engine lost power. Brooks tried to reach Midway but realized it was beyond his capabilities. He ended up ditching into the ocean 4 miles offshore. After abandoning the sinking Buffalo, he inflated his life vest and spent 3 hours struggling in the water before being rescued by a PBY Catalina seaplane. As a result of this ordeal, Brooks suffered from hypothermia and shock. Despite these challenges, he recuperated within 6 weeks and resumed flying Wildcats for the rest of the war. In interviews after the conflict, Brooks admitted to enduring survivors' guilt. He felt fortunate to have survived while more skilled pilots perished, attributing their fate solely to the randomness of enemy fire patterns. Meanwhile, numerous German aviators lost their lives in Me210 training accidents that should never have occurred. Accidents were common due to landing gear malfunctions. Wheels collapsing upon touchdown often resulted in fatal crashes. Aircraft would skid off runways and ignite, trapping pilots inside until it was too late for rescue teams to intervene. Investigations consistently revealed that the Me210's structural weaknesses led to these failures. Even seasoned pilots with extensive flight experience were unable to prevent such tragedies caused by faulty equipment. These casualties are classified as training accidents rather than combat losses, meaning they do not factor into Luftwaffe casualty statistics related to battle engagements. They remain buried in military cemeteries throughout Germany, their headstones marking them as service fatalities without specifying the cause. Similarly, Italian pilots operating in North Africa faced perilous conditions when flying Bar88s that struggled to become airborne under full bomb load. Many lost their lives attempting takeoffs with these inadequately designed aircraft. The planes would accelerate along the runways, achieve takeoff velocity, lift briefly into the air, but then fall back to the ground due to insufficient airspeed. This often resulted in collapsed landing gear as they slid off the runway into soft sand or flipped over entirely. Canopies frequently crushed pilots during such incidents, and the official cause of death was invariably recorded as an accident occurring upon takeoff. In reality, these mishaps were a direct consequence of the Bar88's inability to attain flight with a full combat payload in the intense heat of North Africa. Every pilot and squadron commander was well aware of this issue. Despite knowing the risks, orders mandated that missions be carried out regardless. Refusal to comply could lead to court-martial proceedings. These pilots perished not because they failed but due to institutional shortcomings beyond their control. They exhibited immense bravery by flying planes they knew were inadequate for combat conditions and adhered to their duties despite understanding the perilous odds stacked against them. 1942, Second Lieutenant Charles Kuhn climbed into his Buffalo fighter aircraft knowing full well it was dubbed a Flying Coffin, and that similar models had been decimated by Japanese fighters in Asia. Despite these grim prospects and the likelihood of not surviving for more than an hour, he chose to fly anyway, an act of courage surpassing the limitations of his aircraft. When his plane was shot down, Kun managed to survive through a combination of skill and sheer luck. Even with a shattered instrument panel and a seized engine, he maneuvered the crippled aircraft into a controlled water landing by maintaining level flight long enough to build up sufficient airspeed for ditching. He escaped from the sinking aircraft and swam until rescue boats arrived. His survival was not due to the Buffalo's adequacy, it was because of his skill as a pilot and his refusal to surrender, even when flying an unreliable aircraft. The Brewster Buffalo, German Me210 and Brewster Bar88 are considered among the worst fighter planes of World War II. This is not because they were the slowest or least armed, but rather because they failed in their intended purpose. They couldn't match enemy aircraft, putting pilots at risk and wasting valuable resources that could have been allocated to better designs. These aircraft exemplify institutional failures with dire consequences for those who flew them. In military aviation history, these planes serve as cautionary tales about how not to develop combat aircraft. Their shortcomings taught invaluable lessons that influenced aircraft design for years to come. However, this progress came at a great cost, paid by the pilots who deserved better equipment. The bravery of the men who flew these inadequate aircraft into battle should never be forgotten. They faced life-threatening situations with insufficient tools, and many lost their lives as a result. Their sacrifices highlight the critical link between equipment quality and survival in combat, underscoring how decisions made away from the battlefield can have fatal consequences for those on the front lines. Major Floyd Parks, Second Lieutenant Charles Counds, Oberleutnant Vera Streibe, and countless other pilots who flew subpar aircraft during World War II should be honored not for their planes, but for their willingness to take flight despite knowing the dangers involved. These aircraft were woefully inadequate, yet the pilots who flew them displayed unparalleled courage.